Om Purusham Artam Gunanam Shunyanam Prati Prashavaha Koivaya Swarupa Pratistam Vachiti Shaktihi iti. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. That primordial Shakti power, transcendent of the gunas, which returns transmigrating consciousness to its source, stripping away name and form from nature along the way, accomplishes both, and the soul receives and is delivered into its final emancipation. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Saha Viryam Karavavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu, Ma Vidvishovahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman, absolute reality, protect us. May it sustain us. May it illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. We have gathered together here in Hawaii on the Big Island for our usual Sunday classes. This series is a 3-series class because last week, as many of you know who were attending the seminar that we gave on the Vedantic tools and how to use them at a higher, deeper level, something we all are learning, because those tools are incomparable, philosophically speaking, and they need to become a matter of our sadhana, that Sanskrit word meaning deep, intense practice, in which we contemplate them daily and learn how to utilize them for the highest good for both ourselves and the world. That's rather the Vedantic ideal, at least stated penultimately. So that seminar went off very well with a good attendance, and now we follow up with the first in the class series called the Gunas of Prakriti and the Vrittis of Yoga, or Gunas and Vrittis and Karmas, oh my, as it was called once. As lions and tigers and bears come at us. Well, we've had oxes and lions recently in our class series, ox taming and lion taming, ox herding and lion taming, to be more specific. And now we can go on towards this new class series. Could have been called the Gunas of Samkhya and the Vrittis of Yoga, to keep it in the darshana perspective. But basically it's the Gunas of Prakriti, because the Gunas have been known for time out of mind in Indian darshanas. The Vrittis of Yoga was more of an accent that was placed upon the thought process of human beings in more recent times, thousands of years later than Lord Kapila was Lord Patanjali, which shows the widespread of time and the beings that are keeping an eye on the Dharma over millennia, not just centuries, with an eye to make sure that it's maintained. Those are some of the functions of Lord Shiva. We look into Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva as the Trinity, and each of them have their own specific functions. It seems to fall to Lord Shiva through his Shaktis, through his two incomparable Shaktis, to keep these dharmic teachings alive and in the minds and hearts of living beings. Does that in 4 different ways, 4 padas, the 4 feet. And this definitely resonates as one of those, the accent of the thought process. And otherwise you might study the gunas and think you know them, or come to know them to a certain extent, and how they're one of the first things out the gate in the projection process of the Mahat, the great mind. And then maybe millennia would go by, depending on if you had great souls attending upon the world, Burloka, and you also had guides and gurus that waited upon those souls and kept the Homa fires burning, as we could say, pun-wise. Then you would eventually find out maybe that your thoughts were affected by these gunas of sattva, rajas, and tamas. Later teachers like Shankara might bring out the aspect that there's pure sattva too, beyond just sattva, and that the sadhakas are coming to know about that level. What to do with your mind once it's reached some sort of equanimity where all your needs are satisfied, maybe your desires aren't pressing you so much, and you feel equanimous and life is good. And there's a certain balance that's attained there that may, as you get more experience, be threatened still by some periods of restlessness and some dullness that comes upon the mind, everyone's mind, dark night of the soul, if you will, for all beings. So these gunas are in constant flux and cycles, and we'll look at some of them, tamas, rajas, and sattva. It's not the first chart I'm going to be taking, but you can see that there's a blend of the two called tamo-rajas, and a blend of these two called rajasattva. And so there are the 3 basic gunas of Prakriti, and then there are these admixtures that are going on all the time. Might take a little while for somebody to connect those to their thinking process. They may be thinking at first, maybe it's just a mood. But I've often said that moods are emotions. They belong to the emotional body mostly. And gunas are more like modes, not moods. You can pretty much count on them cycling through every life. And I think that's one of the reasons why the breath is threefold. And your states of consciousness are threefold: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. By breath I mean in-breath, held breath, and out-breath. And there's all sorts of triputtis, or triple teachings, and the gunas go along with those. And they're not just a separate teaching that you would look at sort of from afar, but something you need to connect yogically, because we just mentioned another triputi, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So those are also allocated sometimes straight across to the gunas. Not so much on the level of good, bad, and indifferent, but Shiva can be very tamasic when he comes to destroy the world. It seems like that would, the worlds of name and form will be dissolved, and he's going to take on a wrathful form. How are you going to call that sattva? Ultimately, maybe, if the Lord of Death comes, then it also bows to these greater beings like Shiva and Shakti. And we'll look at some of that in terms of the gunas and the thoughts. I have a new chart started yesterday titled the Gunas of Prakriti and the Vrittis of Yoga. So each time I give one of these class series over the last year or two, I've been creating a chart exactly named after the class series. So it gets more to the point of the current level of teaching I'm trying to assume and transmit to people because they're, as you know, teaching by charting the teachings of the ancient rishis. There's a book out called Footfalls now by SRV that has about 300 charts there. But I've made 60 more since I completed that book, and don't ask me why. I'm compelled to do it, it seems. But every time I look at the teachings of the Dharma, I see deeper. And it just doesn't end. I think, well, okay, I've gone as far as I can with that teaching, and a few months later, oh, there's a connection that comes up, and it's an important one for current times, for contemporary humanity. I've sort of been thinking lately that whereas there's this kind of division between the spiritual and the worldly that has been put forth, and inside of the spiritual there's the householder and the monk, so there's all these little divisions we're making with people, but I think maybe everyone in the world's a practitioner. Some of them maybe in other lifetimes, some of them maybe very rudimentary practitioner, but everyone's learning from the Mayic process. It's just a matter of how quickly they can learn, and to the seers that's a matter of have you died on your zafu yet? I'm sitting on a zafu right now. So have you been able to meditate so deeply that your sense of small self has just abandoned you, and you're left like a hot air balloon. You're left floating without sandbags, high in the sky of your own awareness, even for a minute, or an hour's meditation, or an extended experience over weeks where souls have said they've had this great light come upon them and been drunken, intoxicated with it. As Sri Ramakrishna said, if you get a little taste of that, then you don't run after the things of the world anymore. They're just not interesting to you at all. So, in that way then, creating a title named after each seminar has been coming forth. So next week I'll show you that chart. We'll have a few more of our new students here next week as well. Two to be precise. And that'll be filling the ranks of these practitioners which have been at the Vedanta and Yoga and learning about Tantra and Samkhya's Gunas for some decades now. People are always coming fresh and anew, but sometimes I think that if they are ready and qualified from teachings from the mother cat with her claws out, that's Maya, and they come to the mother who's now got the Abhaya Mudra. You see, it's kind of a difference between this position and this position, and this position and this position. See, the mother cat uncovers her fangs for the mouse and puts out her claws, but that's the worldly person, has to learn by suffering. Good God blog, by the way, that Sri Ramakrishna said. And the universal mother, the spiritual mother, they take refuge in, the devotee takes refuge in. She withdraws her claws and covers her fangs when she picks up that kitten, and places it here and there. As Holy Mother said, I've put you in the circle of Sri Ramakrishna now. You must be fully content there and have this experience of burgeoning spirituality that comes even with the study of a little of the Dharma, a few drops, as Buddha said, of the Dharma. Or as Sri Ramakrishna said, will make a god of a man and a goddess of a woman. You'll become Daiva, divine. Heroic, Virya, and Daiva, divine. And you might leave that cross-section of Pasu, the worldly devotees. I think the three states of the Tantric practitioner pertains to the devotees. There are still devotees who are new to the pursuit of enlightenment and still letting go of things. And so it helps all three levels, though, including somebody who's used to sattva or has been using pure sattva which we'll look at that with Shankar's beautiful teaching, the fencers, the three fencers. The Gunas are always fencing with us. And he talks about pure sattva as being somebody who uses their time for studying the scriptures and doing worship at the altar and meditating more. They would rather be doing that than any of the activities of the world, short of duties and responsibilities, but even those things are beginning to let go. And they're looking for those pockets of time where they can just go be with the Lord, as Vivekananda said. Just want to be with the Lord. Meditate upon the Lord as thine own self seated in your heart, as the Svetashvatara Upanishad says. Beautiful way of putting it. Didn't say meditate upon the Lord as something up in the sky or something that I'm separate from. Meditate on the Lord as your own self. And doesn't say in heaven or somewhere else, but in your own heart. In the heaven of your own heart, if you want to put it that way. So that's why Vivekananda said, I'm a Vedantist. I hardly see any other God anywhere other than in my own self. And so that's the great self we talk about. Even Lord Buddha said, there are two selves, the small self and the great self. Who's the master? Of course, the great self is master to the small self. But even the small self, as we're giving concessions in this class, that everyone's a practitioner or a potential student of the Dharma, needs to hear that Shruti first and foremost. Even that soul is stepping up to the plate and having to take on certain considerations for change. As far as change applies, it has to take place up in the mind. That's where transformation takes place, if it takes place at all. Because of course the Advaitist would not give any room for it. As Krishna says in the Gita, all change really takes place in nature, not in the soul. So the soul is this changeless observer, witness. And we were talking just this morning about that, how the Upanishads will define Brahman as ever expanding. So how does that relate when Brahman doesn't change? It can't be expanding and it can't be contracting. That's from the standpoint of the student that's learning. It seems to be its consciousness of its mind is expanding to embrace more and more of Brahman. But from the standpoint of having tasted Brahman already, having experienced Brahman, that expansion equals infinity. So it's just expanding more and more into its own infinite nature, knowing that it's infinite, whereas previously it thought it was finite, and now it's superimposing change over Brahman. Both of those are allowable positions, non-dualism and qualified non-dualism. Advaita, Vishishtadvaita. Sri Ramakrishna used to favor Vishishtadvaita here on this earth more, it seemed, than he did Advaita, although essentially he was an Advaitist. But for the people, especially for the seekers, and for those who could wield the higher tools, could actually heft the sword and begin to cut away this illusion of the reality of objects and worlds and the 8 fetters and 6 passions and 9 antarayas and all these teachings, which we'll show you in a minute. These are the sandbags you're going to want to cut off, so your hot air balloon can just naturally float up into the skies of awareness. Well, maybe that's enough of a preamble, which I'm usually apt to give, to warm us up to the topic, in order so that we can take these teachings in the next hour and 20 minutes, have a break, and then have another hour. We don't do anything half-hearted here, or for just a few minutes. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, well, I went to hear that preacher, this was in Calcutta in India in the 1800s, and he stood up and he said, God is sour. We have to make it sweet with our own meditations. So he would say that person has obviously never experienced Brahman. He would never call Brahman sour. It's all sweetness there, like sweetness in sugarcane juice. It's permeated with sweetness, bliss or ananda. And then the next thing happening would be a 5-minute meditation, and Sri Ramakrishna would just barely close his eyes, and they'd wake him up out of his meditation. He's just sitting for 3 or 4 hours, like we're going to do here for 3 hours in a kind of meditation on the Dharma today. Fully focused as I want my students to be. I insist on it. And if we can do that, then we expand the mind's capacity to know Brahman. And when the time comes, the right moment, then we'll be able to spend longer and longer times meditating on the self, meditating on the Lord as our own self, seated in our hearts. There won't be any external anymore. In fact, there won't be any internal either. The external and the internal will be rendered into one indivisible state, and that's the state you'll want to meditate upon. But in the meantime, along with the idea of Brahman expanding and how to treat that interpretation-wise, we were always also talking about the blending of equalizing the mind and waiting for the right moment. So I was using the analogy of trying to save someone from drowning, which I did a few times in my surfing days. Even a couple sailors I pulled out of the water once. They should have known the ocean better than that, but they don't know it like a surfer knows it. They know it from the hull of a battleship that's going to war. But I know it from being in it. Surfers know it from being down in it. The currents, the winds, everything. Just like an Eskimo has to know snow conditions to survive. And the same out there, especially if you're surfing on the north shore of Oahu with Waimea and Pipeline. But I divert, but not really, because when you go out to try and rescue somebody, first you have to settle them down from their panic. They're panicking. They think they're going to die and they're drowning. You have to convince them that's not the case. You're going to survive, and settle them down, because they'll pull you down with them if you go just swimming up like a hero. You go, oh, I'm going to save you. It's really not about that. So that's really getting rid of fear. This is a spiritual analogy I'm making. Good God blog too. So after that, then you say, okay, I'm going to save you. You're going to survive. We're going to swim in together. And they take off, and you go, where are you going? You see, where are you going? Wait, I didn't tell you to swim. See those little waves way out there? That's a set. That's what we call a set. And that's going to be 10 or 12 feet high or more if it's a big day when it gets to the reef that you're right now swimming on top of. Stay outside of that reef and you'll just bob up and down, float. You'll survive. That's part of what you get rid of their panic with that kind of reasoning. So it's a very spiritual analogy to the aspirant, you see. So you wait maybe 2-3 minutes, sets go by, and then you see this period where you know there's going to be 3 or 4 minutes without any waves. It's all flat out there. Now swim, you see. And so you swim inside the break, and the waves, you get inside of the white water, and the waves pound you a little bit, which you have to pay for going out there in the first place, and they deposit you on shore, and you're saved, and I hope you've learned your lesson, you see. So basically these teachings come through for the practitioner to get rid of our doubt and fear first, and wait for the mother's timing as far as our samadhi goes, or our higher states of mind, or even learning the Dharma with muscles, learning about the sort of discrimination before you pick it up. How much does it weigh, and what's it made of, what's it signify. We went through the sort of discrimination chart last week, if you were at the seminar, all the things that it symbolizes. So it all pertains very much to this wonderful teaching we call the Dharma, and I think what you call Atmagyan after that. Dharma are the teachings that are, to me, beyond morality and ethics. Even in India, beyond the code of Manu, for instance, how to act, how to behave, how to be moral, and so forth. Then you get to the yamas and niyamas of yoga and teachings like that, and you've begun to come upon these great teachings of the Dharma. And now you're fully awake and with eyes wide open, taking this in. But then when that starts to translate into direct experience, we call it nididhyasana. After you've rolled it over in your mind a lot, then it becomes atmagyan, becomes eternal knowledge. Before it was something you were learning. You thought you were learning. That's the expanding of the mind in Brahman, right? Oh, I'm going to expand to know the Dharma. But the Dharma was always there in you, and it was there in you even stronger than morals and ethics were. If you were raised in conventional religion, all of a sudden you know that you've gone beyond conventional religion, and you're right there at the very essence of the thing now. And you need to retain this. You learned the morals and ethics, and it was a rather easy thing. It should have been for you. But the Dharma is something you're going to have to put some quality time on. And you're looking for those pockets of time. And the gunas get in the way, and your thoughts get in your way. So thus, leading up to this title, the Gunas of Prakriti, they're of nature, and the Vrittis of yoga, that's your thoughts, both positive and negative, and mixed. Klista and aklista. So for those of us who are beginning practitioners, who are tuning in or who will tune in on these classes that are being recorded for posterity, for the future of America and the West, who are learning the Dharma, then we know that the gunas are three. Tamas is depressed, and scientifically you could say inertia. You can't move yourself out of tamas. It's very difficult for the mind to get itself out of tamas. So it does need the help of rajas, restlessness. Restlessness will compel you to break out of tamas. So they work together like that, not always in such a good way as we will see, but that rajas then is the red color, we're putting it here for color coding the gunas. And then if you're very watchful about restlessness, and you find maybe you're getting tired or spinning your wheels too much and not getting any rest and reflection, then basically you'll come upon this sattvic period, and that'll feel like the world is all right, everything's all right with my world. And that's misleading, because nothing's ever all right with Maya. People just think it is, or pretend it is, or hope it will be. But we're beyond pretending and hope and projections of the mind. We're into attaining the eternal. And doing so, you can't get to the infinite through the finite. Sorry, my teacher used to say that all the time. You're acting like you can get to the infinite through the finite. You're going to have to study the finite from a distance and transcend it to get to the infinite, because the finite's just simply not real. So how can it really confer any benefit on you, any lasting benefit? And so that's what you call lessons, and we know lessons in the gunas can be very hard ones. Mother cat with her claws out kind of lessons. And that can go on for a long time. Pain, suffering, ignorance, desire, attachment. You've heard it all from the so-called pessimistic Buddhists and Vedantists and Hindus. Their teachings in world religion lean a lot towards suffering, but compassion's at the back of that. And it leans a lot towards ignorance in Vedanta, but wisdom's behind that. So you're beginning to awaken to this eternal verity inside of yourself, which is called the self in our tradition, without any misgivings, we say that. The indivisible self, not the individual self, is the way I like to put that. The indivisible self, not the individual self. The individual self, Holy Mother said, that's your personality. Try and forget that. Try and realize the indivisible self. Good God blog there. So it leads us up to, with one more thing to be said in the way, is that I'm going to, until we get to that chart next week, the new chart, going to be bouncing back and forth with showing you a few connections between gunas and your thoughts. But when we get to the chart next week, it will really connect gunas and vrittis very definitely. You'll see how that works, the dynamics of it. So in the meantime, we're going to school ourselves again, if that be the case, because many of us who have been in SRV for 10, 20, 30 years have seen some of these charts multiple times. And trying to get that to stick. Snow doesn't stick on a wet road. So how wet are our minds with ignorance, the moisture of ignorance? And then the snow falls and falls and it just melts. So wisdom comes and it doesn't settle and collect. So a dry road needs to be what we're seeking. And so repetition will help dry up the moisture of worldliness and have that perfect surface for the Dharmic teachings to collect on. So one of the things Sri Ramakrishna said, and one of the metaphors he used for this process, was the hot air balloon. So let's look at that chart. There are two versions of it. Those of you on the looking live stream are seeing the orange version of the balloon. No? That's the blue version? Oh, okay. Well, any one you show, the teachings are the same. But I didn't change it. The orange one's a little prettier. But this blue one is the same information on it. So you see there his quote about it first. Rainwater seeks the lowest place to settle. Likewise, the ordinary human mind becomes heavy and dwells on lust and greed all the time. It is like the case of a hot air balloon weighed down by sandbags, so that it cannot soar. Thus, the wise soul frees itself from the sandbags of worldliness with the sharp knife of spiritual self-effort, and rises to inspiring heights directly and effortlessly. So this hot air balloon, back in the 1800s, they were experimenting with all kinds of flotation devices, as it were, not just in water, but in the ether. And so over time, these balloon festivals got together where they were creating these beautiful, different size, different shape, different color hot air balloons and going off into the skies, soaring very high, some of them, sometimes too high. One case where a man and a woman went up and ran out of oxygen. It went so high, and they were measuring conditions of the stratosphere and so forth before the rocket ships got up there. So you can see here the whole outline is in accordance with thoughts, because on one side of the chart, that klista, and the other chart, klista. So everything on the, when you're facing the balloon, the right-hand side, has to do with klista vrittis, negative thoughts. And as it gets closer towards the middle, an admixture of things. And everything on the left-hand side of the chart, as you're facing the chart, are aklista. Those are teachings and words used directly by the father of yoga to mean, basically positive and negative thoughts. So he's right away beginning to connect this. And you can see right below the sandbags that are being cut off, attachment to sattva is one of the bondages, subtle bondages on the positive side of the balloon, that people get attached to one of these gunas. They think they've reached the goal by having unending pleasure, or some sort of balance or contentedness comes to them. And but you need to watch over time and see how your mind gets affected by karmas that are coming forward from your past lifetimes, some scars that you were born with, mental impressions from your upbringings, not just in this lifetime but previously, by the conditions of the changing world, politics and business, war and peace and so forth. All of these things pose a challenge to the sattvic state of a human being. So we would say, on one hand, sattvic state is a relative goal. You'd want to try and reach sattva and retain it, as long as you can stay there. But you have to be aware that it's also a bondage, that all three of the gunas coming from nature are going to be operating in nature. Therefore, if your mind is under the influence of them, you too will be still operating in nature. And we know that these darshanas of India have to do with transcending the three gunas. That's called trigunatita, and also have to do with the mind leaving its refuge in the thinking process, what's often called the intellectual frame of reference. That these two things alone as teachings in the Dharma that I heard from my Swami and teachers that I was with in India. Basically, we know that these two things are to be considered about gunas and vrittis. That they're teachings that happen in nature, and there are certain solutions. We'll look at those actually, maybe later today, if not tomorrow, next week. Different kinds of vrittis that, I think probably in the Yoga Sutras there might be 6 or 8 different kinds of vrittis which Patanjali mentions in the actual sutras that have to do with impure mind, ashuddha mind. And that they all, if you look at them, which is this chart I'll show you next week, you can actually categorize them with tamas and with rajas and with sattva. And then there are some fewer mentions of aklishta vrittis in the sutras that classify very well with sattva and higher sattva or pure sattva. So we'll look at that next week. But enough to say here that if we're going to be looking at sandbags, start off there with this attachment to sattva. That's if you've even managed to attain it for any length of time. That's akin to keeping yogic balance, equanimity of mind. You want to keep an equal mind, and this Buddhism and Vedanta are both well known for this ashobha, keeping free of emotions. Some methodologies want you to explore the emotions, give vent to them, watch them and relive them, sort of. And most of the modes of everyday life, you're not even thinking about it. You're just venting your emotions when they come up. You can't control your anger or your lust or your pride or your delusion. The 6 passions and 8 fetters, you can't control them. So there's a kind of a threefold teaching right there. But this higher level of teaching would be to capture the sattvic mode and retain it and keep it. Can you do that? It'd be like getting the hot air balloon off the ground and getting high enough where the atmosphere itself will float the balloon, and you don't need much helium pumped into it anymore, or hot air. So you want to reach this sattvic balance where you just exist, and you want to try and keep that. Boring is the problem with that. And see, people want excitement, and they want challenge. Some of them are here on earth to climb mountains and dive deep into oceans and so forth. They're adventurers. But we're calling this the adventure of consciousness, because if you get deeper and deeper into the outer nature, then you're getting injured. You're maybe even becoming bored with the things that you thought excited you once you attain them, and they don't satisfy you anymore. And reminds me of a title my teacher used to give in one of his lectures every year. He called "Satiation Never Comes." So he was looking at the American people over some 40 years he taught them, and people earlier in his life when he left India, and just seeing that they kept going through these search for pleasures, and satiation never came to them. Every year he saw them, every interview he had with them, every series of classes he taught, and every time he heard back from them, they were still going in this rounds of trying to satisfy their desires and thinking that that was life. And that, of course, the next step back from that is birth, life, death, rebirth. The whole samsaric cycle, which they're so schooled in India. It's just like one of the facts of life to them. In the West, facts of life are, relationships and things like that. Getting married, those are the facts of life. Birds and the bees stuff. But in India, the facts of life they learned is that everything out here is the horrible Maya. It will never satisfy you, quoting Swami Vivekananda. And so the detachment, the backing off from it, the willingness to engage in a balance that may seem boring at first, but will end up conferring upon you eternal peace. Vilapya shantim parmam bhajasva, Shankara says. Vilapya shantim, unending peace. Parmam bhajasva, supreme bliss, ecstatic bliss. Param, the highest bliss that you can imagine. And that if you get just a taste of, there goes the world. And here comes Brahman. Get ready. And so they court this with this equanimous state of mind. They court ecstasy, which could hardly be called peaceful in the ordinary sense. It's revolutionary. It will strip name and form from the quotient, is what I just chanted at the beginning of this class. And that's emptiness to the Buddhists. And that emptiness is full of bliss. It stripped everything away that you thought was real, and now you're done with it, like all these sandbags falling off here. Let's look at some of them. I'll come back to this chart. Here's some of the sandbags. Take a good look at it first down here. You can give them maybe on the live streaming a good look at on the Klista side. 3 stupefactions, the 8 fetters, the 4 deadly traps, the enemies of reason, 3 of them. That's on the minus side. The plus side would be attachment to sattva, which we just looked at, the desire for heavenly existence, which is definitely a trap in itself as far as those seeking freedom from form and enlightenment. Sense of subtle ego, like the ego is beginning to ripen, but it hasn't ripened yet, and lower knowledge. Attachment to aparavidya. So these are all on the aklista side, plus side, various things that are sandbags that the practitioner is taking the sharp knife of discrimination with, just reaching down there and cutting those off because he can't get his hot air balloon off the ground. How come it won't rise? I pumped enough air into it. Look at, you haven't cut off the sandbags yet. Here's a knife. And so they give it to the guru gives it to the disciple. Well, just to go through them real quick, you might say just for fun, because most of you probably don't have this problem anymore. Hopefully it doesn't last very long if it does come, and because these are things you need to reduce from the quotient. So you can see here the 3 enemies of reason: garva, amartya, and asuya, egotism, intolerance, and narrowness. If reason was your, are you seeing this all right? I sent them to you.
I didn't get them.
Oh, I checked, they were sent.
I know, but it was busy.
Oh, so sorry, live streaming audience, that these, I guess they didn't come through to our computer. Then the 3 stupefactions, Vyutuna Chitta, Ajanataha, and Ahaituka. If you look at these, they're each worthy of spending a little time on. There's a word for worldliness, insensitivity, and jadedness. These are all things that plague us in our mind, in our thinking process, when we look at our culture, that there are certain kinds of people we come across who are very insensitive, and they've maybe had a glut of money and possessions and various things, and it makes them jaded, is the word, jaded. And there you see, I'm going through this quickly because they're just sandbags that you want to get free of. And then there's this 4 deadly traps: guilt, grief, depression, and low self-esteem. Each one of these can be looked at from the standpoint, I think, probably of a beginning, an intermediate, and an advanced practitioner. You'd say maybe in the advanced practitioner there are burnt ropes by now, or burnt strings. Was that Good God blog again? One of those things that Sri Ramakrishna talked about, that you knew them once, but you did the practice that burnt them. But the burnt rope still sits there, the shape of a rope, at least until you blow on it or a wind comes and reduces it to nothing. So you still have a memory of these problems. Well, I remember when I had low self-esteem. Or maybe you have an experience where it comes back to you and you remember, you can think from an advanced state, oh, I remember getting rid of that, you see. So it's still in your mind as a burnt string, as it were. People who are not at such an advanced level, are experiencing these things like guilt and grief. They're very hard to get rid of. Sometimes they're called the 3 here's some more. 6 billows. Those are straight across the board with our 6 passions. You can see there. But maybe the 6 transformations is good to look at too. Asti and so forth. That's pretty much birth, growth, disease, old age, decay, and death. And we were talking just this morning about how there are some sufferings that are impossible to rid yourself of if you've taken on a body, mind mechanism on this planet. Those are things that have to be foreborne. And forbearance is the default zone of the wise, by the way. Forbearance is the default zone of the wise. So with the advanced practitioners, they still have to look at this phenomena in nature called birth, growth, disease, old age, decay, and death. But they're looking at it from the standpoint of a balanced consciousness that's experienced sattva and gone on to pure sattva. Sattva Shuddha, it's called. And therefore, they're looking at it as a process in Maya, or in nature only, as again Sri Krishna mentions in the Gita. But there's some kinds of suffering that you're able to minimize, and that would apply here to lust, anger, delusion, vanity, greed, jealousy. The 6 passions are called, delusion. These you can minimize, but you can't get rid of. So there are some kinds of suffering that are there in the process, cosmic, like birth, growth, death, rebirth. If you're taking on a body on any world, really, even in angelic or celestial worlds, that's why getting attached to heavenly existence isn't going to free you from reincarnation. Heaven just leads to hell again, as they're eager to point out to you in India. And if you're talking about higher heavens, like heart chakra, throat chakra, of course, you're released from the birth and death process there. But if you're talking about the 3 worlds, Bhur, Bhuva, Swaha, or heaven, earth, hell kind of teaching in a lot of religions, then that's a cycle that even heavenly existence with your ancestors won't free you from. The greatest souls like Lord Buddha have been telling us this for a long time. So this other kind of suffering then you minimize. You'll never get rid of anger, and you'll never get rid of the ego. Sri Ramakrishna said the first, Holy Mother said the second. So therefore minimize them. Keep them at a minimum. Anger is demonic. Try never to give rise to it, but minimize it, because it's a part of the process of the collective mind, and it's going to be very difficult for anyone to get rid of it out of a collective mind. It's hard enough to get rid of it out of your own individual mind. So minimize it. And then there are some sufferings, this is the 3 levels of suffering I'm talking about, right now, which is rather my own teaching. There's some kinds of sufferings that are not necessary. You don't need to be going through them. You don't need to have them. You yourself are orchestrating them, illustrating them, suffering them, and those are giving rise to the tendency to come back in ignorance all the time. So these kinds of sandbags, anyway, you want to be cutting away. And I actually, because I didn't have these two charts to show the live streaming audiences, because I thought of them about 15 minutes before I left for this class on my drive, and threw these in my roll of charts real quick, and I sent them, and I thought they got through in a computer, but I wasn't going to spend a long time of them, just long enough to show you what kinds of things the mind that wants to soar in timeless awareness has to get rid of. It's one of these things that we had also at the seminar last week, if you remember. Remember we talked about certain things that were impeding your use of higher Vedantic tools. And we had a six-fold list on that had to do with your own individual problems, and then your education, that you had to educate yourself in the Dharma. And one of those things had to do with the study of matter. If you make a complete study of matter, then you'll get this detachment from it, because you see that all things that are having to do with change, which means disease, illness, old age, death and disease and decay, are happening in nature. It's a very welcome teaching for the soul to be able to step back for that and say, well, I'm the Atman, undecaying, diseaseless, formless. How can it have any of those when it doesn't have a form? And identify fully with the form, with the flowers instead of watering the weeds, as we say in Vedanta. That's called Pratipakshabhavanam. So back to the hot air balloon here, we see that Sri Ramakrishna has then just told us rainwater seeks the lowest place to settle. So we're going to need to cut these sandbags off. In that one fell swoop, we took care of the whole bottom part of this chart. And Sri Ramakrishna says it very nicely. In fact, what he wants you to do would be something like this. Sharada Ramakrishna Nami Pande Keche Rebai. Sharada Ramakrishna Nami Pande Keche Rebe. Veshabhuvan Veshe Galo Aha Boli Hari Jai. Veshabhuvan Veshe Galo Aha Boli Hari Jai. Sharada Ramakrishna Nami Pande Keche Rebai. Sharada Ramakrishna Nami Pande Keche Rebai. It says, precious brothers and sisters, can you hear that distant sound sweeping towards us? Like the approach of a great flood, the powerful names of Sharada and Ramakrishna are storming the boundaries of relative existence. Like a surging ocean of ecstatic bliss, annihilating the imaginary boundaries between matter and spirit. The courageous devotee who stands before this onrush of waves of pure knowledge beholds the dissolution of the entire phenomenal universe as it is swept away in an overwhelming conflagration of unifying love. What an awesome sight. What an unimaginable experience. Can you sense the sweet spiritual wind of their pervasive presence? Why not raise your sail to catch it? Strike off the moorings which tie the boat of your aspiring mind to the harbor of mundane attachments. Sing Ma, Ma, Ma. Pray earnestly for their grace and take refuge in Kali, the Divine Mother of the universe. Ma, 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 Bole. Mayer Jole Koli Jai,
Ma bole, Mayer bole koli jai, Shadra Ramakrishna name bande kechere bai, Shadra Ramakrishna name bande kechere bai.
So the names of the great deities are the mantra. And the mantra is one of the elements of that knife you're given to cut off these sandbags. And he says here nicely, break off, untie the moorings. You see the moorings of where the balloon gets tied down, so it won't rise too early. There's precious timing again, auspicious timing that we hear about. And let's look at some of these moorings. On the klista side of things, that is, the soul is ignorant of its true nature at birth. It's attached to the senses. Vishaya Vritti, one of the thoughts that goes through the mind. The thoughts aren't just something that happen, or I think them, or they're random or something, but this is actually a kind of samskaric impression left in the mind. This is the way I think, or this is the way I don't have to think if I want to change myself. So that's one of the vrittis that Patanjali mentions, attachment to the senses. And there are souls who are born who are not so attached to the senses. We see that. And they're bound by desire and obsessed with matter. And so these are four very main problems with the bound mind, who has, under the force of this klista vritti, they probably have not done very much cutting away of the sandbags, of the 6 passions, 8 fetters. I could have shown the 9 attarayas, I could have shown the 5 kleshas, and so forth. Every system has this list of what we're calling sandbags right now. And the moorings on the other side, you can see where the soul is thinking deeper, is beginning to think, but they're proud of their knowledge. So this is showing some of that intellectual frame of reference that we're seeing in some of our savants, and particularly in the West nowadays, but throughout the cycles of time in the world, beings have come upon this owning of knowledge. And wouldn't it be better just to leave it at its source and drink at the source and be gracious when you drink, and give it all to the Divine Mother, whose wisdom it is, as Sri Ramakrishna did. Seeking of subtle bliss, there is what we just talked about already. That's pretty much sattva. That one of those sandbags you want to cut away is that there's a unending, eternal, undying bliss called ananda, which is different than contentment, and it's different than joy, and it's different than happiness. So you want to try and raise the hot air balloon of your mind to higher thoughts like that. So subtle bliss shows up its weakness because it's an attachment. Basically, and if you're looking at that in yoga, it's sleepiness, restlessness, which are just tamas and rajas really, and then attachment to subtle bliss, which is sattva, and the fourth one is attachment to dualities, good and bad, pleasure and pain, virtue and vice, life and death. These are the 4 blockages to meditation, because Patanjali's yoga is really a yoga of meditation. That is meditation proper in India. Raja Yoga is it, whereas Buddhism has its own schools of meditation. But for us, we look toward the 8-limbed yoga because that's what's leading us to samadhi, through meditation to samadhi, 7th and 8th limbs. So it may seem to you as you start off studying the Yoga Sutras that there's a lot of other things he's taking you through. The the Dharma teachings that seem a little bit like morals and ethics, like nonviolence and non-stealing and so forth. Those have higher ramifications. And then he's taking you on towards being able to sit and control your breathing. That's kind of where you leave ethics and morals behind, isn't it? Because you're not finding that in other religions as such a science. So they're putting together posture and breathing. You're finding that in India, in Buddhism and in Hinduism. That they want you to practice these exercises. And then that's supposed to lead somewhere. And that's going to lead you to, this fifth limb, which is getting your mind under control. Pratyahara, it's called. And just be able to detach from the objects outside and inside, to get samadhis with objects and samadhi with concepts of objects, and then go beyond that and be able to concentrate on the Lord. It's dharana. So the whole thing is taking you towards the feet of the Lord, or the Divine Mother of the Universe. And then she's taking you, as I just chanted the last sutra of yoga at the beginning of this class, she's taking you then to deliver you to your final emancipation. Kaivalya swarupa pratishta, he says in the Sanskrit. Kaivalya is isolation from nature. Swarupa is your essence. Pratishta is being steady in your essence. So Kaivalya swarupa pratishta. Chitti Shakti does that for you if you take refuge in her. The very last sutra of the four padas of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Raja Yoga, Ashtanga, if you want to call it that. So how deep that goes, how far it takes you when you look at that. And it reminds us here that even if you're at that subtle bliss level, you need to go beyond that. Because these beings, again, then are bound by good and driven by success. But failure always accompanies success, and negativity always follows good. Good and bad are chains that hold, one of iron, one of gold, as we like to say. So this takes us to the moorings. These are what the song is just saying. Strike off those moorings that bind thee to the mundane world and mundane its passions. Strike off those. So that maybe that same knife that you cut away the sandbags should also cut away the moorings. Unless you have someone out there untying the knots of the moorings. Maybe could be the guru. Okay, you can sail now. The knots are untied. Now cut off the sandbags. Do that yourself. You see, you're finding out that you can free yourself. See, and some friend. You may need friends in high places, as we say. Well, you can see on either side of this balloon as we rise up the chart, just like our mind's rising in the Dharma teaching here, like a hot air balloon. On the Lista side, there are the force of samskaras, you see, blowing at you. These are winds that are both favorable and unfavorable. And the Klista side, they're going to tend to be unfavorable. I mean, I could have put a list here of them that would have been like the list at the seminar last week. The things you have to do to separate yourself from the influences of beings who are not seeking liberation, just put it, and who are satisfied with the world, or who are seeking heaven. We've all come through in our upbringing, particularly in this day and age, beings whose goals are relative like that and limited. And we heard the goal of the paragatam, the higher goal of enlightenment, and the bliss of formlessness, and how to free our minds from thoughts. And we heard these great teachings, and we began to practice those. Experiment with them at first. As our founder Lex Sixon said, or as I said, the adventure of consciousness. It became very intriguing to us, like myself when I was in my early 20s. This had a ring of familiarity to it, for one thing. And I had my samskaras that were positive. And by watering those, thinking about taking Sanskrit in college and finding a guru, and our founder Lex Sixon, who was 10 years my elder, coming into my life, everything was like these winds blowing me toward a favorable position. And Like Swami Vivekananda says, Divine Mother, I can't be a hypocrite. Divine Mother saved me from all that. So that was I must say that too, saved me from going back to the world or being caught in family, ancestors, education, or any of those things as an end in themselves. And I saw this as a goal and started marching towards it. And however long it takes then is the length of time in which you're going to have to invest until you too then will have one of these experiences that reveals to you your true nature. Call it Atman or Brahman, either way, or Busho, or Buddha called it Pragyaparam, supreme intelligence. Then you'll have that vision in any given lifetime. And that's a hot air balloon that's not coming back. So you won't take on sandbags anymore. It won't get caught in the birth, life, death, rebirth cycle anymore in ignorance. So if it comes back at all, as Vivekananda said, it will come back in full knowledge of itself and be a blessing unto others. So next to the force of samskaras, as we look up the middle side of this chart, the red flags are the 6 passions there. We already looked at them, but there they are, conveniently put up the rigging of this balloon on the outside. Lust, anger, greed, delusion, vanity, and jealousy. Nice that jealousy is at the bottom, because Swami Vivekananda said that was one of the worst in this day and age, both in his country and in this country. There was a kind of climbing up the ladder on the backs of others that was going on, that he really denigrated. He said it was the worst thing. When will man be friend to man? Man unkind, he would say. And it was all due to jealousy. And so in India, in Krishna and the Gita and so forth, we have these teachings of the pari karmas. Basically, you want to be very helpful and happy for those who succeed. So, it's particularly in spiritual life at this point. On the other side, on the Klista side, you can see that the winds of karma are blowing also. So the samskaras and the karma have a very deep connection with one another. What you do over and over again, like cows walking back and forth from the barn to the field, causes a rut as they walk. So if you're doing these things that are before you've cut the sandbags off, then you're running a rut in your mind with these negative samskaras, and maybe mixed samskaras too. And you tend to come back with them. And when you come back with these samskaras in any given lifetime, like generations of doctors or lawyers, let's say, or generations of worldly people, then you're just coming back to add more gloom on gloom, as Vivekananda says. Strike off thy fetters. I think it's down here, isn't it? Strike off thy fetters, bonds that bind thee down, shining gold, darker, baser ore. So you're piling more gloom on gloom, he goes on to say. So you want to make sure that the samskaras that you're creating are of a positive nature. They don't get talked about that much because there are not that many people demonstrating them, because good, sattva, is not necessarily one of the best samskaras to create. As you can see, it can lead to desire for heavenly existence and success and so forth. Taking the unreal for the real, as Vedanta would say. So you can see then on the balloon itself, on the Klista side, selfishness is one consideration. Seeking fame, narrowness, particularly I think in terms of bigotry and hypocrisy in religion. Ego obsession, worldliness, which we already pointed out in this chart on the 6 passions and the 3 great traps. And love of pleasure. That's that sattva again, coming back to haunt you. So all of those are strands of this mind balloon. On the other side, the klista side, you can see from the outside in, dharmic wealth, contentment, peace of mind, dharmic family, maintaining sadhana, and moral flexibility. So those are where the samskaras are becoming more positive. The winds of karma becoming warmer and more beneficial to you and to others. And the balloon is making its ascent. When it does, and that's all under the heading of lower mind, as you can see. It's still influenced by the three gunas in cycles. And it still has positive, negative, and mixed thoughts with it. So we're already beginning to make the connection here between, the gunas that are cycling and the thoughts people are having in them. And if you have the thoughts in the gunas, that causes a way of thinking in you called a samskara, and it may adhere to your mind all your life, like a cow walking back and forth, getting himself in a rut from that same repetitive action. Not to say that there aren't good repetitive things you can do, like sitting and listening to me for years, many of you have been doing. That's been repeating dharma and repeating jnanam and so forth. So that has a positive samskaric effect in us. You'll go beyond knowledge and scriptures too when you get to higher mind. What's higher mind? Meditation on divine reality, contemplating God with form, thoughts on philosophical inquiry, that's called atma vichara, and service of God and mankind. And most of you sitting here, oh, that sounds familiar. And those are the four yogas. Meditation is Raja Yoga. Contemplation, God with form, is the Bhakti Yoga. Thoughts of philosophical inquiry is Jnana Yoga. And service of God and mankind is Karma Yoga. So this is where higher mind, if it seizes on these four yogas and makes this the religion of the age, rather than heavenly existence, the religion of the age, or my success, my personal wealth, and so forth, even on the aklista side, where good thoughts are breeding heaven-seeking souls, because the Upanishads right away said we got beyond the heaven-aspiring senses. The heaven-aspiring senses. We got beyond them. They were seeking pleasure. They were seeking happiness. That's where we said, ho hum, boring. See, been there, done that. And we began to plumb the depths or see the heights, depending on, you're talking about an ocean or the ethers above you or within you. That pretty much wraps up this chart, except for these two very nice quotes. And this is Lord Buddha's on the right-hand side. There you can see the sword of wisdom there, a little image of it. He says, out of the Dhammapada, fear has he none, who has surpassed both good and evil, fortifying the mind like a citadel. Let the wise fight delusion using the shining sword of wisdom. So, Lord Buddha, that is definitely one of the greatest of all spiritual beings to ever take a form here on earth, quote Vivekananda, unquote, was aware of all these levels. People being fear, people getting caught between good and evil, how to do practice and fortify the mind like a citadel, and become wise and fight ignorance with the shining sword of wisdom. It's just full of almost those four yogas right there. It's full of these kinds of purifying teachings that will leave the mind in a higher state all the time. Where's my friend? Oh, he already cut his sandbags. See him way up there? That's his balloon floating off into the ethers. See, so souls have come to earth and left it behind, waving to the crowds below. It's like Sri Ramakrishna used to say, you go up the Oktraloni monument, which I've seen there in Calcutta, go up the Oktraloni monument, which you used to be able to do in older times. You know, when you get to the top, it's pretty tall there in the park there in Kolkata. So you look down there, and he said people just looked like ants. You know. And so he likened that, good God blog, he likened that to my meditation. You know, my mind soared so high that the world and everything just diminished and went away, as if like insignificant. And only the light of myself, and I was probably still availed of a mind, a pure mind. And therefore, still a witness of these kinds of things. And on the other side is this beautiful song of Ram Prasad, "Come to Sail with Me." Untie the complex mental knots that moor you to the mundane realm. Unfurl the sail of Tara, 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 the Divine Mother's liberating name, and ply vigorously the oars of intense spiritual practice if you wish to set sail and cross the stormy ocean of delusion, samsara. So Ram Prasad always putting it in very blissful ways. And it reminds me of a beautiful song that we're wont to sing when we talk about breaking free and soaring. Vitani vinati raghunandana se dukha dandva hamara bitao ji. Vitani vinati raghunandana se dukha dandva hamara bitao ji. 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 Vitani vinati raghunandana se. This is my prayer to thee, O Raghunanda. So he's praying to Ram, the avatar, preceded Krishna, Krishna's previous incarnations. This is my prayer to thee, O Raghunanda, the bliss of the Raghus. Kindly destroy my mind's tendency to perceive duality. If God appeared to you and said, "You got one wish, buddy. What's it going to be?" Tulsidas would say that. I got it. I've pre-thought this. Just destroy my tendency of my mind to see duality and everything will be fine. I'll be in that non-dual state of bliss. Because it will remove all sorrows and sufferings arising from my being. So they come back even on a great devotee like Tulsidas. For Atman alone abides. Now here's his resolve, right? Here's his resolve against these recollection of cutting off the sandbags. Atman alone abides, nothing else exists. It is attachment to relativity that gives birth to the miseries of life. And then we go on singing other verses. Can't you see Ram, Tulsidas praying to you with folded hands? Take me swiftly to the distant shore of blissful transcendence beyond this ocean of delusion, where transitory existence is experienced again and again in seemingly endless cycles. And the verse that made me think of this song was this soaring. It says, "Salutations, kindly confer your blessings upon me, so that my wayward mind will dwell continually on ye, like a soaring swan fresh from flight, taking refuge in the protective cage of your lotus feet." So that's that soaring swan, hot air balloon, tendency of the I'd say natural tendency of the mind to lift off the gravity of these lower considerations that probably it should have never got itself trapped in the first place, them being unreal and so forth, and pain-bearing. You know. klista. They're pain-bearing. Father of Yoga tells us. So, as I think this are once a year or once every 2 years, look at the hot air balloon. A simple saying of Sri Ramakrishna brings out the Dharma like this. You just need to contemplate it for a while and savor it. And it was one of my teachings 5 years ago. I remember going to Portland. What am I going to teach? What station will I teach these same Dharma teachings to? Now, I'm going to teach it from the standpoint of savoring it. Like that's manana. You know, it's just like something you, like I said, if I can just get these duties and responsibilities aside, I can go savor that beautiful sweetmeat of the Dharma. You know, my mind's lingering on it all day, but these other things are getting in the way. Some time has come. You know, and now I can put all that away and take my Atman out like you could see a fruit in the palm of your hand and just meditate upon it. Oh, the world's coming back. Hide it back, you see. Hide it back away. They won't understand. We only have some 10 minutes in this half, but we can at least get into this Gunas chart. And you can see the 5 gunas listed up the left. Black, brown, red, reddish pink, turning to yellow, turning to white. And let's see. Look up with me across these main teachings. Tamas is darkness and sleep. Tamorajas would be bondage, bandha. Even the word in Sanskrit sounds like our English. Rajas, mrisa, or pretense and vanity. Like my success, my wealth, me, I, me, mine. Rajasattva is spiritual awakening. Like the Chaitanya is actually higher than that, but I couldn't think of another good Sanskrit word because Sri Ramakrishna used to say, you know, Chaitanya ho, may your consciousness be awakened in this very lifetime. And sometimes he'd even smack you on the head or touch you somewhere when he said that to you. So that was your precious, auspicious lifetime there. And sattva, mumukshutvam, is a good word for it. The true desire to be free. So if sattva just leads you living your nice life of hatha yoga asanas, riding your bike to work, and dressing up in yogic clothes at the end of the day, and going and dancing and singing kirtan, and eating vegetarian or vegan foods, and that's all it left you with, then you didn't get to the meaning of sattva. You're going to get stuck in a nice lifestyle of sattvic bliss. One of the obstacles that Patanjali lists in the meditative life or contemplative life. Where to take it then? Well, I mean, I could jump ahead a second and just give you the definition here of, since I'll take up this chart early, but we'll look at it deeper later. So you can see here as we go up the chart, there's mixed sattva, and then there's pure sattva. What if a person reached beyond mixed sattva that I just described? There's also mixed sattva of a worldly person. I was describing the mixed sattva of a beginning spiritual aspirant. But if a person reached deeply, they attained sattva and they said, this is good, I can do better. And then there's the best. You see, it's really got that inward moving, good, better, best in the mind. Won't stop like that swan. You know. It wasn't just Tulsidas that's mentioning the swan soaring to higher lakes, but also the Buddha mentioned that as one of his teachings. They want to go from more pristine to more pristine, further away from humanity, deeper and deeper towards the more fantastic view from the mountaintop. These teachings the Buddha gave. So if we wanted to get there, and this will end our class, first half of our class, and we want to jump to this chart doesn't really go into as deeply, sattva shuddha, or this pure sattva, then, well, put it this way, you know, avarana is covering, right? And you know vikshepa is distorting. And you know sattva is revealing. Well, this is liberating. When you get here, you're at a place where you're encountering the Lord as thy own self in your own heart. It's like calling to you very deeply. And you're feeling this rise of Kundalini yoga. I mean, the hot air balloon is now turned into her. She's like, you know, causing you to want to ascend to the highest heights, the deepest depths. So what would a being like that be into? Purity and use for liberation and reflecting the Atman and emanating light. It sounds like a person who's fairly well accomplished and settled into the spiritual life, not just the dharmic life, but into the divine life. I used to make that distinction of dharmic life, divine life, and no life. No life means eternal life. It means that you're never born, you never die, and you just are. I am that. Previous to that, the power of revelation was giving you absence of pride, which is showed over here in the 6 passions, right? Beneficial desire, like Zen's 3 pillars. Oh, I have the great doubt now. I've seen the world as it is. I have a great doubt about it. See, that's a good thing, by the way. Children, parents of children would be looking for that in India, you know, in dharmic times. What? You don't like this? You're not happy here? Very good. Come with me. Let's get the teachings of where reality really exists inside yourself. Via sattva as an avenue, spiritual practice, sense control, that's that pratyahara we mentioned, shraddha, faith, bhakti, devotion, mumukshutvam, the desire for liberation, and dvaiva, the divine nature comes forth. Not just the heroic nature, but the actual divine nature comes forth. So this is all sattva and pure sattva, which is an inward road, a path leading to a pure desire for liberation that is not going to abandon you later, whereas ordinary sattva, sometimes like green scum, will reveal you and cover you again. Fall back into vikshepa. Through some distortion that's still in your mind, and you know, could be any of these or it could be even subtler things, philosophically speaking, it returns you back to covering power. What happened to me? I was so much better 2 years ago. Like lots of people, I wish I could relive my youth. See? But it was in their youth, Holy Mother says, that you should be practicing these things and getting them under your control so you won't even have an old age. It's not like, oh, I got older and I forgot things, or, you know, you won't even have an old age. You'll just be ageless. You'll live in your eternal self. And so she said, all these things you want to do spiritually, do them now while you're young, because the prana is going to be weak later. It's going to be hard to compel yourself to do that. So I gave you an advanced look at the Sattva Shuddha, and after we take our break, we'll come back and look at some of the conditions of our thoughts that go along with these gunas in this first half of this first class called Gunas of Prakriti and Vrittis, thoughts in yoga. So here, let's take our break.